Ever wonder why some conversations leave you feeling powerless, like someone's quietly holding invisible strings to your emotions? Beneath the surface of everyday interactions lurk hidden strategies designed to shape your choices, trigger your weaknesses, and subtly steal your strength, often before you even know it's happening. This book is not your usual collection of quick-fix communication tips. Instead, it's a deep plunge into the shadowy world of psychological manipulation, exposing subtle yet powerful tactics that can shatter confidence and control. Here, you'll learn how to spot, resist, and rise above these invisible games, building a shield of true emotional resilience that no manipulator can penetrate. Emotionally Untouchable, Staying Strong in Any Relationship, written and published by Stealth Psychology. Chapter 1. Spot What Sets You Off. Imagine you're sitting across from someone you thought you could trust, a partner, a friend, or even a family member. The conversation begins innocently, just the mundane back and forth of everyday life. But then, out of nowhere, they make a sly comment that twists your words, challenges your memory, or plants a subtle doubt about your worth. Suddenly, you find yourself apologizing when you don't know what for, confused about whose memory is correct, or frantic to regain their approval. While it seems like an isolated misunderstanding, the truth is quietly more sinister. These moments are rarely accidental. They are carefully constructed fragments in a larger design, meant to manipulate your emotions and erode your sense of self. The ultimate goal is chillingly precise, emotional control, rendering you vulnerable to deeper manipulation, whether it's to control your choices, isolate you from support, or siphon resources from your life. In the shadows of everyday relationships, psychological manipulation thrives not because it's overt and obvious, but because it is artfully disguised. The manipulator learns what makes you tick, what triggers your doubt, and which of your emotional levers can be pulled again and again to get the desired reaction. Perhaps it's by expertly feigning vulnerability so your empathy can be mined, or by sowing seeds of guilt so subtly that you become increasingly desperate to atone for imagined wrongs. The effect is gradual, almost invisible at first. You might rationalize their behavior, believing it's just a quirk or a misunderstanding. You want to believe the best, and that hope becomes fertile ground for their tactics to take root. For many, the true scope of this manipulation isn't visible until the damage is already significant. Confidence eroded, boundaries blurred, the echo of someone else's will in place of your own. Most victims don't see the red flags for what they are. Instead, they might blame themselves for overreacting or being too sensitive. Manipulators specialize in this subtle distortion, keenly aware that if you doubt yourself, you're far less likely to doubt them. They isolate their victims not just physically or socially, but by separating the victim from their own inner compass, making you question your reality, your needs, and ultimately your right to feel secure and valued. To break free, you must first recognize these fracture lines before they can deepen. The power of manipulation is in its invisibility. Only by bringing these shadowy tactics into the light can you begin to defend yourself. This chapter is about developing a critical awareness of what sets you off, those comments, gestures, or silences that unsettle you but somehow seem so trivial. By sharpening your perception at these subtle points of tension, you start to reclaim the control manipulators so desperately want to keep from you. Awareness here is the first weapon. Once you see the game for what it is, you have already begun to win it. The effects of psychological manipulation seep deep into the fibers of your emotional world, infiltrating not just your feelings but the very framework upon which you build your choices, relationships, and sense of self. The manipulator's carefully crafted words can unsettle your emotions like a stone thrown into a still pond, sends ripples through your calm, replacing clarity with anxiety or guilt. You start to question whether your reactions are justified or whether you're somehow at fault for feeling hurt in the first place. In this swirling confusion, your decision-making becomes vulnerable, less rooted in your own needs and values, and more shaped by the manipulator's agenda. Imagine a person who once felt sure in their ability to say no. Over time, constant pressure and well-timed emotional flare-ups make even the simplest choice feel grounds for doubt. Your inner narrative shifts. turning self-assurance into second-guessing with every encounter. Relationships themselves are the terrain most deeply scarred by these invisible tactics, because trust, the vital bridge connecting people, is a manipulator's favorite tool to deform and weaponize. A common dynamic plays out in the story of Emma, an otherwise confident and sociable woman whose partner gradually began to undermine her trust in herself. Each time Emma made plans with friends or voiced an independent opinion, her partner reacted with hurt, acted aloof, or implied that her behavior was selfish or disloyal. Before long, Emma found herself isolated, shrinking her world to accommodate his moods and demands. Even as her friends expressed concern, her reality had shifted so far that she insisted nothing was wrong. Her partner had convinced her she was simply being caring, attentive, good. This slow corrosion shapes a person's self-esteem more deeply than overt insult because it is wrapped in expectation and praise that only comes at the price of compliance. Research in social and cognitive psychology echoes the lived experiences of people like Emma, demonstrating how chronic manipulation deliberately weakens an individual's confidence in their own perceptions and instincts. Dr. Jennifer Fried's research into betrayal trauma underscores how those most targeted by psychological manipulation, partners, children, close friends, are often the least likely to abandon or confront their manipulators, not out of weakness, but because the manipulation has subtly rewired their ability to trust themselves. These findings explain why truly intelligent, caring individuals often remain ensnared in these relationships. Their empathy, conflict avoidance, and desire for connection are expertly turned against them. The tragedy is that these patterns are so well buried beneath smiles, small talk, and seemingly rational disagreements that most victims cannot tell where genuine care ends and manipulation begins. Manipulators are masterful at blurring this line, disguising control as affection, or subtly withdrawing approval until submission feels like the safest option. As boundaries fade, so does self-esteem, leaving even the most resilient individuals fragile, dependent, or surprisingly eager to please. The urgency to recognize such dynamics cannot be overstated. What appears progress through a minor argument today becomes the silent erosion of autonomy tomorrow. Yet the true danger lies not just in what is done, but in what is overlooked. In the next part, we will unravel the hidden warning signs, those subtle red flags that slip by unnoticed in the heat of emotion, but hold the key to unlocking your emotional freedom. Manipulators are rarely impulsive in choosing whom to target. Their selection is both opportunistic and calculated. They observe the temperament, insecurities, and boundaries of those around them, gravitating toward individuals who display patterns of empathy, conflict aversion, or a deep desire to be liked. These qualities, so often interpreted as emotional intelligence or kindness, become the very traits that make someone a prime candidate for manipulation. Consider the scenario of Mark, a diligent colleague always ready to step in for others, often at the expense of his own workload. A manipulative coworker, noticing this helpful nature, slowly began framing requests as emergencies or leveraging praise to ensure Mark's compliance. Over time, these urgent favors became expectations, and Mark found himself increasingly overwhelmed, hesitant to object for fear of appearing selfish or uncooperative. Such dynamics are not limited to workplaces. In family settings, manipulation often hides beneath years of habitual interaction. Take the case of Lucy, the responsible daughter who is subtly guilted by her parent each time she contemplates a life choice independent from their plans. Phrases like, "I just can't manage without you," or silent withdrawal leave Lucy crippled by loyalty and guilt, unable to remove herself from commitments that sap her energy. In romantic relationships, this pattern is recognizable in the partner who alternates, unpredictably, between affectionate dependence and subtle withdrawal of warmth, making their significant other jump through emotional hoops to regain favor. At the heart of these situations is a gradual psychological shift. Each instance of acquiescence, even if seemingly minor, feeds a cycle. The target learns that peace is best maintained through compromise or self-denial, rather than open communication. A self-survey researcher, Dr. Marianne Segedi-Masak, describes this as the erosion of agency, where targets slowly lose the confidence to assert boundaries as manipulation becomes the norm. The psychological impact compounds as the victim's need for acceptance becomes hooked onto the manipulator's approval. This twisted dependency strengthens with each manipulated interaction, narrowing the target's sense of self and power to make independent choices. These shifts often go unnoticed at first, masked by rationalizations such as, "They had a tough day," or "Maybe I am too sensitive." By the time the manipulation feels suffocating, the target's internal compass and sometimes support network has eroded significantly. Recognition of these patterns is therefore not merely academic, it is critical self-defense. Understanding how manipulators identify and ensnare their targets equips you to see beyond isolated instances and recognize the looping strategy in play. If you see your own reflection in these scenarios, know that this is the beginning of resistance. Once these tactics are exposed and the psychological tilt becomes visible, you have already shifted the balance away from their control and back toward your agency. Armed with this knowledge, you are prepared for the next revelation, where the manipulator's tactics do not simply stop at subtle shifting, but escalate into tighter cycles of control that can entrap even the strongest individuals. In the following part, we will dissect how this escalation unfolds and how to recognize when passive shifts become the chains that bind. Chapter 2. Care less, feel more. Anna prided herself on being compassionate. She went out of her way for loved ones, quickly giving comfort, advice, and support, even in moments when she herself was stretched thin. One evening, she found herself nodding along sympathetically as her partner Jake bemoaned another disappointment at work that, according to him, was everyone's fault but his. Over time, Anna noticed this routine returned whenever she voiced her own frustrations or raised a need in the relationship. The pattern was as insidious as it was familiar. Whenever she tried to focus on her own feelings, Jake managed, by complaint, accusation, or wounded silence, to shift the topic seamlessly back to himself, demanding her endless empathy. Yet Anna struggled to see the trap closing around her. Of course, she felt called to help. What kind of partner would she be if she didn't care? In the manipulator's toolkit, emotional centering is perhaps the most underhanded tactic. By convincing you that only their needs matter or are urgent, they hollow your emotional reserves for their own use. Their ultimate goal is not simply to draw out empathy, but to teach you, slowly and with purpose, to ignore your own needs while staying emotionally reactive to everyone else's. Over weeks or months, the scales tip. You become the emotional caretaker, the confidant, the problem solver. Eventually, your own feelings are neglected, quietly repressed to maintain peace, and your focus zeroes in obsessively on their satisfaction and moods. The manipulator grows stronger for every tear you soothe, while you weaken, disconnected from your true self. The boundaries that might have signaled self-care are quietly bulldozed in the name of compassion. This shift is neither sudden nor dramatic. It's woven so subtly into daily exchanges that most victims never see where their exhaustion ends and duty begins. Utility is transformed into care as manipulators reward your empathy with brief periods of affection or attention, only to remove them when you attempt to prioritize yourself. What Anna, and many like her, cannot recognize until it's far too late is that love and care have become tools of control. The manipulator's world runs on your attention. Their crises or discomfort become your next project. And by the time the imbalance becomes unbearable, you are left empty, feeling selfish even for asking, "What about me?" This approach devastates emotional well-being, cutting the victim off from self-compassion while ensuring they stay vigilant to the manipulator's every mood swing. It's not just about winning every argument or claiming the most sympathy. It's about building a partnership, or friendship, or family dynamic, in which one person gets to feel deeply while the other is trained to minimize their heartache. What emerges is a chronic sense of guilt and emotional confusion, a fog in which genuine care exists side by side with psychological servitude. Seeing this covert exchange for what it is requires a radical recalibration, a willingness to care less about their validation and more about the honest signals of your own mind and heart. Recognizing the trap does not make you callous. It is, in fact, the first step toward feeling authentically without manipulation clouding your emotions. The consequences of this kind of emotional manipulation extend far beyond momentary confusion or frustration. They distort the core of self-understanding and self-worth, leaving scars that can linger for years. When you are taught, step by step, to set aside your own feelings in favor of focusing endlessly on another's, the natural rhythm of emotion and response becomes warped. Your own needs start to feel foreign, even shameful, and a subtle anxiety seeps in each time you imagine voicing dissent or asking for help. Instead of navigating life with confidence, you find your choices shaped by the perceived moods and likely reactions of the manipulator. A dinner invitation from a friend becomes an agonizing dilemma. Will Jake be resentful if you accept, or will he spiral into complaints about loneliness and being left behind? The process eats away at decisiveness, creating hesitation where there once was clarity, as you unconsciously seek to avoid conflict or further tension. Relationships built on this kind of imbalance become dangerously asymmetrical. Psychological studies, such as those by Dr. Susan Forward, have shown that emotional manipulation encourages a pattern of caretaker syndrome, a dynamic where one individual exhausts themselves to appease while the other learns to demand ever more. In one case, a woman named Carla describes how, after a year in her relationship, she found herself canceling social engagements, forfeiting hobbies, and apologizing for short moments of happiness unrelated to her partner's needs. Every time I felt joy without him, he'd sulk or accuse me of ignoring him, so I learned to hold back, she says. Over time, Carla's identity and self-esteem contracted. She measured her worth only by her ability to erase his discomfort. The longer this cycle continued, the more ground she lost, until her natural sense of joy was replaced by vigilance and responsibility. The sweetness of care had been eroded, transformed not just into exhaustion, but into guilt for even feeling the need to replenish herself. Psychologically, manipulative relationships activate deeply rooted social instincts. The manipulator, often unwittingly at first, exploits the human tendency to seek approval and avoid rejection. Dr. Jennifer Fried's betrayal trauma theory, for example, notes that victims, especially in intimate relationships, rationalize exploitation precisely because acknowledging the truth would threaten their sense of connection or emotional safety. People fall for these tactics not because they are weak or naive, but because empathy, loyalty, and hope are the very currency such manipulation trades in. What begins as small sacrifices in the name of love or peace slowly snowballs into a total reshaping of identity, leaving the victim emotionally depleted and yet strangely more desperate for the manipulator's approval than ever. The most dangerous aspect of this manipulation is how invisible it remains to those entrapped, disguised as care or compromise. By the time distress or imbalance is acknowledged, self-worth has suffered, trust in one's perceptions has faded, and the lines between love and obedience blur almost completely. That is why learning to recognize these patterns matters as an act of emotional survival. In the next part, we move closer to exposing the overlooked clues, subtle warnings buried beneath the day-to-day routine that hold the key to reclaiming your emotional freedom. For manipulators who excel at emotional centering, choosing the right target is often a matter of careful observation and subtle testing. They are adept at reading a room or a social circle, gravitating toward those who respond readily to distress, criticism, or expressions of vulnerability. People who possess a strong fear of conflict or an intense desire to help others. These individuals might be quick to reassure when someone appears upset or uncomfortable, often making sacrifices to avoid disappointment or confrontation. Manipulators recognize these traits as opportunities and begin to intensify the intensity and frequency of demands, increasing emotional dependency by exploiting the target's generosity and compassion. Consider the example of Rachel, a manager in a small company who valued being seen as approachable and kind. A particular subordinate, Emily, frequently sought out Rachel for professional and personal advice, weaving her needs seamlessly into the rhythms of the workday. At first, Rachel was pleased to be a source of support and guidance. Gradually, however, Emily began to drop subtle hints about her inability to manage projects without Rachel's direct oversight or approval, repeatedly expressing how essential Rachel's emotional investment was to her well-being. Each time Rachel attempted to reclaim boundaries or redirect responsibility, Emily responded with disappointment, hurt looks, or roundabout criticisms delivered through mutual colleagues. Caught off guard, Rachel felt an increasing compulsion to step in, laboring under the unspoken threat of failing Emily as a boss and possibly a friend. Over weeks, Rachel's role quietly shifted from mentor to caretaker, her decisions and emotions increasingly tethered to Emily's reactions and unhappiness. This pattern is replicated in countless variations, not simply in the workplace, but within friend groups and families. Manipulators often subject their chosen target to small loyalty tests or emotional temperature checks, perhaps an exaggerated response to a minor slight, or a public mention of how difficult or overwhelmed they feel, strategically disclosed to elicit sympathy and intervention. Victims, in turn, begin to anticipate these patterns, structuring their daily lives and emotional states to forestall the manipulator's disappointment or censure. The shift is usually subtle but profound. Self-esteem and personal satisfaction are slowly crowded out by anxiety over the manipulator's needs and continuous pressure to do the right thing, even at personal cost. Over time, these incremental changes can upend foundational beliefs about boundaries and healthy relationships, with the victim no longer certain when or how they lost themselves in another's shadow. The manipulator's feedback, whether approval, affection, or validation, soon becomes vital to the target's well-being, creating an unbalanced cycle of vigilance and exhaustion. This destabilization of identity is a core tactic. Only by seeing the mapping of these behaviors can one begin to reclaim their emotional space. Recognizing the signs that you're being targeted is not simply about protecting comfort. It is fundamental self-defense for your emotional sovereignty. Understanding how manipulators pick, shape, and sustain these toxic dynamics marks the start of genuine resistance. In the coming section, we will closely examine how this pattern escalates, ultimately forming the cage in which so many find themselves trapped, and what you can do to break free before the door fully closes. Chapter 3. Back yourself. Every time. It was a Monday morning when Daniel walked into the boardroom, project notes in hand, and the subtle hum of tension already in the air. He had put in weeks of painstaking work and was prepared to present ideas that would shift the direction of his team's strategy. As the meeting began, a senior colleague, Leah, quickly took command by casually mentioning her concerns about Daniel's data. With a forced sweetness, she spotlighted one obscure statistic and pressed him to justify it. Before he could respond fully, her tone subtly shifted from skepticism to authoritative fatigue, hinting that Daniel's research might be unreliable. Others in the room, uncertain but eager to avoid confrontation, fell silent. Daniel felt the energy shift. Instead of leading, he was on the defensive, scrambling to defend not just his presentation but his capacity for judgment itself. This is the insidious art of undermining confidence, a psychological maneuver that rarely announces itself openly. Manipulators wield these tactics to keep control, casting doubt so that those around them are less likely to challenge, question, or even form independent thoughts. Leah's ultimate goal was never simply to clarify one data point or improve the group's outcomes. Her intent was strategic emotional control, stripping Daniel of authority while reinforcing her own influence with the rest of the group. In workplaces, families, friendships, or romances, this tactic looks much the same: gradual erosion of a person's faith in their own abilities, setting them up to defer, comply, or surrender in the name of group harmony or personal survival. Most victims recognize moments of unease or humiliation, yet underestimate their cumulative impact. At first, Daniel told himself Leah was under pressure or just misunderstood his explanations. After all, he was prone to self-doubt. It was easier to second-guess himself than confront the disquieting notion that someone might purposefully want him to appear incompetent. This is the first door that closes behind many. The belief that the discomfort felt in these interactions is insignificant compared to the apparent social cost of pushing back. Each new instance serves to hammer away at boundaries, diminishing resolve in a gradual process that is often invisible until too many doors have quietly clicked shut. What makes this mode of manipulation so devastating is its subtlety. Leah didn't need to shout, threaten, or become confrontational. Her undermining was clothed in concern, couched in the polite vocabulary of teamwork and improvement. It's a camouflage that works especially powerfully on conscientious high achievers, those committed to getting things right and maintaining group goodwill. Over time, micro-attacks on confidence accumulate, and the primary effect becomes normalized self-doubt, rather than overt fear or hostility. This produces a compliance that benefits only those pulling the strings. To back yourself every time is not mere bravado, it is the antidote to these invisible injuries. Self-assurance is dismantled gently from within, until individuals like Daniel begin to surrender leadership, agency, and voice before they even realize what's at stake. The truth, lurking beneath the surface, is that only by learning to recognize this invisible oppression in motion can anyone begin to break free and reclaim their power. When psychological undermining takes root, its first assault is launched on your emotions. The initial confusion and sting of doubt that people like Daniel feel can morph into pervasive anxiety, quietly shadowing every future thought and action. This undermining isn't a single, jarring hit, but more a persistent drip of uncertainty that leaves you second-guessing even your most familiar strengths. In time, feelings of inferiority or apprehension begin to dominate situations that once held excitement or drive. Daniel, for instance, soon found himself rehearsing answers with excessive detail before meetings, becoming tense at the slightest hint of criticism and internally shrinking from challenges he would have otherwise embraced. This emotional turbulence inevitably extends into decision-making. Faced with the manipulator's relentless sowing of doubt, victims grow reluctant to trust their instincts. Every choice becomes overanalyzed, filtered through an imagined lens of future scrutiny. Psychologist Albert Bandura's concept of self-efficacy, an individual's belief in their capacity to execute actions successfully, illustrates the damage precisely. Bandura's research demonstrates that repeated exposure to subtle yet intentional undermining weakens self-efficacy, reducing productivity, stamina, and even the willingness to attempt new tasks. Daniel, once proactive and openly creative, noticed how quickly he deferred options to others, seeking validation where he once offered it. The sharp decrease in risk-taking, paired with relentless self-doubt, had obvious professional consequences but also spilled into his social and personal choices, locking him in patterns of avoidance. Relationships built under the heavy shadow of manipulation turned brittle and complicated. With every act of self-censorship, victims feel further isolated, not only from manipulators, but from peers and even loved ones who might present genuine support. This brings to the surface why so many individuals get caught in the web in the first place. Manipulators are tacticians who thrive on ambiguity and plausible deniability, deploying tactics that are hard to explain without seeming petty or accusatory. Few are willing to risk social equilibrium with accusations of sabotage dressed up as concern. Those targeted often internalize the problem, convincing themselves that asserting discomfort would only lead to ridicule or rejection. Case studies on workplace bullying and family gaslighting reveal that repeated diminishing from even one dominant personality can erode group trust and connection. Individuals conditioned to depend on external approval are likelier to surrender autonomy and retreat into self-doubt, leaving the manipulator unchallenged. The tank of self-esteem drains slowly. Confidence once available on demand now must be summoned with intentional effort, and even then, often appears fleeting and paper-thin. Over time, victims build an identity around defensiveness, retreating into conformity to avoid drawing fire. For Daniel and countless others, this means enduring the slow grind of ambition and vitality. The greatest trick the manipulator plays is convincing you that your lack of progress is entirely your own flaw, while all along they have been chipping at the foundations of your belief and voice. To truly back yourself every time demands an unflinching recognition of how easily the mind can be bent by persistent skepticism and subtle sabotage. Far from being isolated incidents, these experiences are connected signals. In the next section, we will shine a light on the overlooked warning signs, those nearly invisible patterns that reveal you are under attack long before the damage feels irreversible. Manipulators seeking to undermine confidence do not select their targets at random. They are perceptive judges of atmosphere and personality, seeking out those with open minds, remarkable dedication, and a persistent need for validation from authority or community figures. People who are eager to prove themselves or maintain harmony, especially in group settings, are prime targets because their willingness to accommodate makes it easy to insert doubt disguised as helpful criticism. Often, the manipulator's earliest moves are disguised as subtle advice or requests for clarification, seemingly supportive but strategically designed to highlight small gaps in your knowledge or remind you of past mistakes. Sociologist Dr. Dan Alwis, whose pioneering work on bullying dynamics offers insight spanning both schools and workplaces, notes that those regularly selected for targeted undermining are often highly competent yet markedly non-confrontational or new to a specific environment, anxious to avoid friction. For a vivid example, look to Thomas, a skilled designer new to a tight-knit marketing agency. His enthusiasm was clear, and he was keen to impress the team. Early meetings saw his ideas quickly redirected or dismissed by a more established colleague, Erica, who frequently complimented Thomas's contributions, then asked if he was aware of certain advanced techniques, a pattern repeating whenever Thomas presented something new. She never raised her voice or made overt criticism. Instead, each question or correction gently implied that Thomas still had a lot to learn. Soon, even when Erica wasn't in the room, Thomas approached his own work with a sense of impending scrutiny. He preemptively watered down new ideas and policed his own proposals, second-guessing design decisions or apologizing in advance for possible flaws. The impact was subtle at first. He became more reserved, avoided his own opinions, and deferred judgments to colleagues he once regarded as equals. His sense of authority was quietly chipped away, the effects radiating out into his willingness to take risks and the pride he once felt in his accomplishments. These psychological shifts gather strength through repetition. At a high school, Mina, once a top student, fell into this same net when her favorite teacher frequently expressed concern about her losing focus. Pushed to constantly justify herself, Mina developed hypervigilance about every interaction with that teacher, eventually coming to believe her success was precarious and likely to collapse without continual external approval. In both stories, manipulation did not scream its intentions. It whispered, questioned, and suggested, until finally the victim's sense of certainty was overwritten by low-simmering anxiety, withdrawal, or endless self-editing. Tragically, these subtle tactics are often invisible to those on the outside, who may observe only the manipulator's charm and the target's growing quietness. The cumulative, gentle distortions rarely provoke enough alarm for intervention, meaning those most in need of self-defense must learn to recognize patterns themselves. Understanding these methods disarms their power, providing the foundation for true resistance. When you notice that your confidence depends more on staying out of someone's aim than on the value you bring, pause and reflect. This knowledge does not guarantee instant freedom, but it does begin to unravel the invisible shackles. As you move forward, we will explore how, once established, these cycles of control escalate, deepening until the target feels irrevocably trapped. If you have found these insights useful or recognize them in your own circle, take a moment to reflect and consider supporting growth by engaging with and following this channel. Chapter 4. Say No Without Freaking Out. Claire had always been the one to rely on, for her family, at work, and in her circle of friends. Her reputation for lending an ear, picking up slack, and smoothing over awkward situations seemed to define her very sense of self. One evening, her brother called yet again, asking for a loan to tide him over a rough patch. Claire's finances were stretched, but the words stuck in her throat. Just as she considered declining, her brother's tone grew sharper, his voice suffused with disappointment. "I thought you cared. I guess I was wrong to depend on you." Faced with guilt, Claire gave in, fearing conflict and crushed by the weight of anxiety over letting him down. Even as she transferred the money, a small voice nagged inside her, questioning why saying no felt like an act of betrayal instead of self-preservation. This is the invisible snare of manipulated compliance. where a simple refusal becomes a battlefield pulsing with fear, guilt, and self-doubt. Skilled manipulators are experts at weaving requests into emotional obligations, deftly transforming boundaries into supposed evidence of your coldness or selfishness. Their ultimate goal might be financial gain, as with Claire's brother, or it might be emotional reinforcement, increased dependency, or even subtle social dominance. Regardless of their aim, what unites all skilled manipulators is their deep understanding of a powerful truth. People will do almost anything to avoid the sensation of guilt or exclusion, even when it compromises their well-being or personal values. Victims like Claire often fail to see precisely when they passed from doing a favor into participating in their own manipulation. At first, the requests might seem reasonable, and the fulfillment of them is met with gratitude or affection. However, the moment compliance becomes the rule and not the exception, it subtly shifts the power dynamic. Refusal, now charged with tension and risk of emotional consequence, grows harder to deliver, and the manipulator quickly learns how to magnify every tremor of hesitation. By exploiting discomfort and vulnerability, they train their targets to equate resistance with failure, as friends, as colleagues, or as family. In the blink of an eye, a simple no transforms into the center of an emotional storm, where saying what you truly want is suddenly the most dangerous thing you can do. The trap's true genius is that it disguises itself as generosity or devotion. Claire's world didn't fall apart when she said yes one time, or even two. It was only after years of diminishing her needs, playing peacemaker and benefactor, that she became aware of the tight, anxious grip around her very thoughts. By then, even saying no to a small request felt monumental. The lesson hidden here is chilling. When a manipulator conquers your right to say no, every other boundary soon follows, and regaining your freedom becomes a task fraught with conflict and self-doubt. Recognizing this sly recalibration is the first secret to escaping it. When a person is persistently manipulated into compliance, the most immediate casualty is their emotional stability. The fear of displeasing others becomes a baseline anxiety, quietly infiltrating every decision and interaction. For someone like Claire, each new request from her brother carried a fresh wave of guilt and urgency. Even imagining resistance pulsed with dread. Rejection, disappointment, and the accusation of being unreasonable felt not like possibilities, but like inevitable consequences. This emotional stress is insidious in its effect, blurring the line between self-interest and selfishness until asserting even the smallest boundary feels morally suspect. The chronic tension gnaws at confidence and self-trust, making it almost impossible to identify a request as manipulative rather than a legitimate need. The sacrifice of clear decision-making is just as profound. Faced repeatedly with emotional pressure, manipulated individuals find themselves defaulting to yes, not based on personal conviction or capacity, but as a quick escape from discomfort. Small choices start to carry outsized consequences. Saying no begins to feel dangerous, even reckless. As this pattern solidifies, victims may lose track of their own limitations, consistently overriding exhaustion, financial limits, or emotional needs just to avoid another conflict. Dr. Harriet Lerner, renowned psychologist and author, describes this phenomenon in her seminal work on boundaries. She outlines how chronic guilt and fear of confrontation lead to a state of emotional hostage, where a person's actions are dictated not by genuine consent, but by the urgent need to maintain peace and approval. The fallout in relationships is often slow but devastating. Instead of mutual support, the relationship shifts into a transactional dynamic, where affection or approval becomes contingent upon compliance. Claire noticed over time that her brother's gratitude rarely lasted beyond the next request, and her increasing reluctance was met with silent withdrawal or accusatory reminders of all she owed him. This is not only common in families, it happens among friends, where someone is routinely expected to shoulder extra burden, or in workplaces where relentless favor-asking is disguised as camaraderie or team spirit. Over months or years, resentment builds. Yet it's often self-criticized, since the victim has internalized the manipulator's logic, questioning whether boundaries are just evidence of one's own inadequacy. Self-esteem pays an even heavier price. The more often compliance overrides personal will, the deeper the internal narrative of powerlessness. People are conditioned to view their reluctance as a failing. If only I were stronger, less cold, more caring, maybe then I'd have the right to say no. This cycle breeds shame, not just about the act of acquiescence, but about one's perceived inability to set healthy limits. Research by Dr. Brené Brown on vulnerability and shame reveals that chronic people-pleasers develop a fractured relationship with their identity, mistaking constant giving for self-worth and losing the ability to discern genuine generosity from emotional self-sacrifice. It is in this fog of misplaced obligation and eroded self-assurance that compliance transforms from a simple habit to a locked cage. The more entrenched the pattern, the less obvious the manipulation becomes. In the next section, we will uncover the subtle cues and signals, the hidden warning signs, that most people never see until the consequences feel inescapable. Manipulators who rely on extracting compliance are highly attuned to the emotional environment around them. Rather than target just anyone, they are drawn to those who reveal themselves as conflict-averse, helpful, or eager to uphold a positive image in their social circles. They test the waters subtly, making minor requests or feigning vulnerability, carefully watching for nonverbal cues of hesitation or discomfort. If the target folds easily or seeks approval, the manipulator quickly recognizes an opening and adapts their strategy, layering guilt, expectation, or implied threats of emotional withdrawal. This process is so gradual, it usually passes beneath the threshold of conscious awareness, turning kind and responsible people into unwitting participants in their own manipulation. Consider Hannah, who was regarded by her friends as the group peacemaker. Though always ready to offer support, Hannah often agreed to inconvenient plans or invested time and resources far beyond her comfort. Her friend Olivia mastered the quiet art of cultivating dependency, painting everyday setbacks as emergencies that required immediate help. Whenever Hannah suggested she was too busy, Olivia responded with disappointment, passive-aggressive silence, or stories about how others in her life had let her down. Over the course of a year, Hannah lost count of how many times she rearranged her schedule, even canceling personal commitments so as not to risk Olivia's quiet displeasure. What began as small obligations soon snowballed. "Could you help with a ride? Can you talk tonight? I really need you," morphing into a chronic expectation that Hannah's presence and solutions were always available. The outcome for targets is a series of subtle but significant psychological shifts. Each time Hannah said yes against her better judgment, she eroded her capacity for self-advocacy. Her internal compass, once attuned to her real energy levels and limits, became blunted by relentless vigilance over Olivia's moods and possible responses. A sense of quiet dread accompanied even the otherwise ordinary act of turning down a request. This anxiety compelled Hannah to preemptively justify boundaries, apologize for minor oversights, or second-guess decisions she previously made with ease. The erosion didn't happen overnight. Rather, it crept in slowly until her default emotional state became one of depletion and quiet resentment. Such patterns are not limited to friendships. In work settings, employees with high agreeableness often find themselves routinely selected for additional tasks by manipulative supervisors. Those supervisors who cloak their requests as opportunities or group necessities, while rewarding compliance with occasional praise but punishing limits with icy distances or thinly veiled displeasure. Betrayed by their instinct to be helpful or team-oriented, these individuals adapt by silencing their objections, convincing themselves that their discomfort is less important than harmony. Over months, self-doubt becomes so ingrained that the mere idea of assertiveness produces a somatic response, knotting in the stomach, tension, or an involuntary apology. Understanding how manipulators identify and reinforce these patterns is crucial. Only when you see this as a recurring strategy, not a personal inadequacy, does authentic resistance begin. By naming the subtle shifts and recognizing the internal hijacking of your ability to say no, you move one step closer to reclaiming your autonomy. Next, we will examine how, once established, these cycles of control intensify, making freedom and self-protection even more urgent. If you find clarity or connection with these truths, help this channel grow by subscribing and sharing your thoughts in the comments. Together, we can unveil even more of what it takes to break these cycles. Chapter 5. Keep cool when it's messy. Late on a stormy evening, Samuel found himself in the middle of a heated family confrontation. What began as a discussion about dinner plans quickly spiraled into a barrage of personal jabs, historical grudges, and tearful accusations. His cousin had mastered the art of chaos, thriving in the emotional tempest, seizing every opportunity to escalate the conflict and keep everyone off balance. At the peak of the tension, with voices rising and arguments flying, Samuel felt his control slipping away. His cousin, mask of innocence in place, delivered one last biting remark, pinning the turmoil squarely on Samuel's shoulders. In the aftermath, Samuel sat stunned, guilty, and disoriented, his own narrative blurred by the fallout. Only later did it dawn on him that in all the disarray, his cousin remained remarkably composed, guiding every surge of emotion to secure sympathy, redirect blame, and avoid accountability. This is a quintessential maneuver of advanced psychological manipulation, the calculated creation of chaos as a smokescreen for control. The manipulator provokes vulnerability in their targets by triggering emotional volatility, while subtly ensuring they themselves remain untouched by the turbulence. The goal may be emotional control, to keep family members on edge and easily swayed, or perhaps social isolation, casting the target as unstable so others gravitate toward the manipulator's calm authority. Sometimes the true game is simply compliance, maneuvering those in the emotional whirlwind to make desperate concessions they would never consider in calmer moments. What ensnares the victim is not always the fireworks of the argument, but the orchestrated confusion and the aftermath of self-doubt. It is in the confusion and the mess that people are most susceptible to surrendering their own truth. When every emotion feels larger than life, and every word is sharpened to wound, the natural human instinct is to seek relief as quickly as possible, apologize just to end the tension, accept blame to stop the anger, or comply to reestablish peace. The manipulator recognizes this instinct and exploits it. In Samuel's situation, his cousin had no interest in resolution. Each escalation was carefully curated to draw others into emotional overdrive, preventing healthy processing of conflict or clear-headed communication. The victim, overwhelmed by noise and guilt, is left struggling to piece together what really happened, never realizing how skillfully their reactions were steered and amplified. All too often, those caught in the crossfire of this manufactured chaos emerge confused and ashamed. Their rational defenses battered by emotional overload, they buy into distorted narratives or allow manipulations to go unchallenged. The manipulator walks away not just intact, but strengthened, holding the unspoken loyalty of those they have steered through the storm. The full extent of this entrapment is rarely recognized until the costs are measured in fractured relationships, persistent anxiety, or a deep sense of failure that lingers long after the conflict subsides. Seeing this manipulation for what it is, a deliberate pattern rather than mere misfortune, is the hidden truth beneath the mess. Until victims recognize the strategy behind the chaos, they remain vulnerable to repeated entanglement, losing themselves each time emotions run high. To keep cool when everything feels out of control is not just a skill, but a form of necessary resistance, one that can only begin by facing the reality of manufactured emotional storms. The emotional fallout from being manipulated through orchestrated chaos is profound and relentless. Victims, swept up in sudden conflict or an unending swirl of accusations, tend to experience overwhelming emotions, anxiety, fear, shame, and pervasive self-doubt. All reasoning is forced to the background as panic takes center stage. People find themselves fighting to keep up, unable to anchor their thoughts as expected roles and bonds seemingly erode before their eyes. Samuel, in those volatile family moments, felt his self-trust fray as he struggled to make sense of the emotional debris. Resolution never truly arrived. It simply dissipated, leaving behind the uneasy sense that he alone was the cause of the unease, even though none of this had originated within him. The manipulation of decision-making is equally insidious. Caught in a whirlwind of emotions, victims lose the ability to distinguish whether their choices stem from conviction or desperation. The manipulator's game is to create enough stress and urgency that target responses become almost automatic. This is confirmed by the work of Dr. Paul Ekman, whose study of emotion in social contexts illustrates how high-stress communication blurs memory and coerces impulsive, guilt-driven cooperation. Samuel agreed to new family rules and gave up his preferred plans, desperate to restore peace, not recognizing for some time that he was acquiescing not to genuine consensus, but to the demand for order amid chaos. Over time, these repeated surrenders train the mind to leap at quick fixes in the heat of confusion, feeding a cascade in which surrender seems the only reasonable action. But emotional turbulence leaves its deepest mark on relationships. Friendships and family ties shaped under constant conflict become scripted performances, defined by avoidance and anxiety. Each fresh flare of tension leaves wounds and silences simmering beneath the surface, respect and trust giving way to covert power struggles. One case is that of Marissa, whose mother would plunge their household into chaos around holidays or gatherings, inevitably blaming Marissa afterward for her supposed insensitivity. By the time Marissa reached adulthood, family events were attended with dread. She no longer anticipated warm connection. Now she steeled herself for confrontation. This dynamic is replicated in 1,000 forms, the manipulative party controlling not only behavior, but the collective memory of what is real and who is to blame. Over the long term, the self-esteem of the manipulated erodes. When every reaction is scrutinized or weaponized, individuals lose faith in their motives and responses, questioning their every word and stance. Shame takes root where self-respect once lived. Studies such as those by Dr. Maria Konnikova on gaslighting and emotional abuse highlight how long-term exposure to such dynamics can reduce psychological resilience and increase susceptibility to further manipulation elsewhere, creating a cycle that persists far beyond the initial relationship or setting. Why do people fall into these traps? The chaos is designed to exhaust and confuse. Even perceptive, self-assured people may instinctively seek resolution rather than conflict, especially when the pattern is well disguised or rooted in habits established over years. A manipulator's success relies on the belief that unrest signals personal failure, not orchestration. The chaos is never random. It is a tool to claim emotional territory. Understanding these mechanisms is not simply intellectual, it is survival. In the coming section, subtle red flags will be examined, early warning signs that hint at manipulation long before surrender becomes the default and before the cost of mess multiplies beyond repair. Those who weaponize chaos and confusion are not indiscriminate in their choice of focus. They choose targets carefully, often cueing into vulnerabilities revealed during moments of stress or high emotion. People who tend to avoid conflict, who step in as peacemakers, or who bear visible guilt in heated group encounters, are among the first to catch a manipulator's attention. The manipulator quietly observes those most rattled by drama, who find open expressions of anger or distress intolerable, and swiftly sets traps during group disagreements or intimate crises. The ultimate prize for the manipulator is finding someone whose greatest discomfort is with tension itself, a person who craves harmony so deeply they are willing to absorb blame or offer concessions just to see the storm pass. Take the experience of Raj, who prided himself on unity within his friend group. During every outing, there would inevitably be an outburst, usually started by one friend, Julia, over seating arrangements, restaurant choices, or supposed slights in a conversation. Raj would respond by mediating as quickly as possible, begging others to let things go, or offering his own apologies in hopes of restoring calm. Julia, meanwhile, seemed almost to thrive in the discord, watching Raj attempt apologies on behalf of everyone and escalating complaints if immediate concessions weren't made. When the dust settled, it was Raj, not Julia, who was exhausted and laden with responsibility for group morale. Julia, in turn, enjoyed the quiet satisfaction of directing emotional energy and attention toward her narrative. What Raj failed to realize in those moments was how Julia's messiness trained him to flinch away from healthy confrontation and to settle for peace even when it required betraying his own perspective. The psychological shift that unfolds within targets of chaos-based manipulation is both nuanced and cumulative. Initially, victims attribute their unease to interpersonal quirks or group dynamics. It is easy, at first, to assume that tension is temporary or that one's own actions can fix relationships if only the right tone, gesture, or apology is found. However, this mindset shifts with repetition. Each time the manipulator inserts turmoil or fabricates crisis, the victim becomes less anchored in their own truth and increasingly conditioned to associate calm with personal sacrifice. They internalize the lesson that dissent, honesty, or strong boundaries will only prolong turmoil, so compliance becomes second nature. This might look like agreeing to plans they dislike, apologizing preemptively, or even mediating on behalf of the manipulator, anything to keep the environment placated. Over months or years, one's natural responses, courage, assertion, and self-advocacy, atrophy under the heavy routine of tiptoeing through manufactured tension. Workplace settings mirror this pattern. Managers adept at shifting blame or sparking conflict will often delegate critical or thankless tasks during crises, watching to see who accepts extra duties without complaint. Once identified, these compliant employees are drawn deeper into patterns of over-responsibility, subject to further manipulation through constant stress cycles. In families, parents or siblings who routinely generate chaos may narrow their focus on the child who intervenes, striving to fix relationships. The very child whose self-concept becomes intertwined with the feudal guardianship of household peace. To spot the cycle at work is the beginning of self-defense, the act of stepping out of chaos to see its architecture. Discerning pattern from disorder allows the first act of resistance, even if its scope is only an internal vow not to own others' mayhem. Next, we will examine how these escalating entanglements become tighter, making it harder to break free as habits turn into lifelong frameworks. Recognizing these systems before they become part of your self-story is crucial for your own liberation. If these insights sound familiar or brought clarity, do support this channel. Subscribe, comment your experiences, and share these lessons. Your participation helps arm others with the tools to keep cool and claim freedom, no matter how messy it gets. Chapter 6. Be solid, stay kind. In a bustling office where the pressure was always high but support was scarce, Miranda found herself shrinking to avoid notice. Her supervisor, a master manipulator, would privately praise her work but subtly sow doubts about colleagues, implying that no one was truly trustworthy. Whenever a project went wrong, Miranda was pressured to quietly fix the problem, soothe the supervisor's frustration, and keep details hidden from the rest of the team. The expectation was clear: keep the peace, make others look good, never expose anyone's faults. On the surface, it seemed the supervisor wanted harmony and loyalty, but the reality was harsher. Underneath the facade lay a deeper aim: social isolation and complete emotional control. By pulling Miranda in close and hinting at secret alliances, then whispering threats of betrayal or rumors if she revealed anything, the supervisor ensured Miranda's every move was dictated by fear of exclusion and desire for approval. As time passed, Miranda began withdrawing from teammates, declining shared lunches or avoiding conversations where her supervisor's name might arise. Requests for help went ignored because she was fed constant reminders about who did or didn't deserve her trust. Whenever uncertainty or mistakes occurred, Miranda was reminded that her loyalty and silence would protect her, while asserting herself or extending kindness to others would leave her vulnerable. All the while, the manipulator stood at the center of a web, dividing and conquering silently. Miranda, convinced her integrity lay in obedience, failed to recognize how she had been maneuvered away from clarity, self-respect, and genuine compassion for others. Manipulative tactics like these are devilishly effective because they exploit our most human desires: inclusion, belonging, and the need to feel valued. These needs, if unchecked by strong self-awareness and solid inner principles, make it easy for a manipulator to wield kindness as leverage. What begins as a simple act of compliance or trust becomes a warped loyalty, a behavior maintained more out of anxiety and fear than real care. The manipulator's ability to control is multiplied when their target seldom questions underlying motives or risks voicing uncomfortable truths. With the goal of compliance and social isolation always at the forefront, even simple acts of kindness or honesty, start to feel risky and confusing to the victim. By the time Miranda realized what was happening, her original intention to bring warmth and connection to her team had hardened into constant self-protection. Loneliness and loss of solidarity snuck in unnoticed, hidden beneath good intentions and the desire not to make waves. The sad irony is that this erosion of kindness does not create a truly peaceful environment. It breeds further mistrust and loneliness. Only when Miranda began to question the strange contradiction, why, in a space that prized loyalty, did she feel so isolated and on edge? Did she see the outlines of the trap woven around her? This awareness marks the crucial hidden truth. Being solid and staying genuinely kind requires the strength to resist manipulation. Cultivate real trust and draw lines between compassion and unhealthy allegiance before it's too late. The consequences of being manipulated into isolating loyalty or weaponized kindness reach further than many realize, shaping interior lives with quiet but destructive force. Emotionally, individuals like Miranda drift into a persistent state of hypervigilance, consumed by worries about loyalty, trust, and potential betrayal. What masquerades externally as careful navigation of social dynamics gradually becomes internalized anxiety. Every interaction is filtered through suspicion, every moment of warmth double-checked for risk and second-guessed for motive. Stress compounds over time, tightening the grip of the manipulator, so that Miranda and others like her grow to equate emotional safety with secrecy, agreement, and the avoidance of genuine, vulnerable relationships. This erosion of emotional trust has a corrosive effect on decision-making. Instead of acting from principle, conscience, or compassion, the manipulated individual makes choices primarily to avoid the manipulator's disapproval or potential fallout. Researcher Dr. Robin Stern, in her studies on gaslighting and emotional conditioning, has found that people exposed to chronic isolation tactics will often adjust their boundaries downward, rationalizing exclusion and secrecy as necessary for peace or teamwork. Miranda's daily decisions, once open and generous, slowly calcified into silent calculations. Who might be watching? Is this kindness okay, or will it cost me? Who is truly on my side? Over time, the skill of honest assessment atrophies, and any authentic self-direction is replaced by constant scanning for signals from the manipulator, confusing fear of betrayal for genuine caution. Relationships under this cloud become a landscape of fragmentation. Colleagues or friends may feel the cooling effect of walls going up without understanding why, while the manipulated person mourns the loss of former solidarity but feels incapable of reversing it. Real-world examples abound. In offices, teams falling apart when trusted insiders stop communicating. In families, siblings divided overnight because the parent whispers different warnings and allegiances to each. In a university case study, a professor discreetly played graduate students against one another, each believing they risked rejection if they questioned their special status. The result was exhaustion and collective bitterness. Not just mistrust, but a collective drop in morale and performance. Self-esteem, too, slowly unravels. Victims start to doubt their own judgment, blaming themselves for the nagging sense of loneliness or unease. They chew over imagined flaws. Maybe I am too sensitive. Maybe I really can't be trusted with other people's secrets. This self-doubt deepens as kindness is continually rebranded as naivety or a cause for suspicion. Jennifer Fried's betrayal trauma theory notes that when positive qualities like kindness and openness are consistently manipulated, they paradoxically become sources of guilt, confusion, and even shame, a cruel reversal in which the best parts of the self are exploited until they become weaknesses in one's own eyes. Why do those like Miranda fall for it? A deep urge for connection, a history of wanting to belong, and a desire to help, all admirable. All dangerous if not paired with discernment and boundaries. The manipulator's advantage lies in knowing that the human heart wants to be liked, trusted, and good. But without vigilance, that yearning makes anyone, no matter how solid or kind, vulnerable to exploitation. Next, the subtle clues and patterns that signal the web is being woven tighter than you realize will be revealed, so you can learn to stay true to both your strength and your compassion. Manipulators who thrive on dividing trust or transforming kindness into a form of submission are rarely careless about their process of identifying targets. They subtly study the group or environment around them, making quick mental notes on who repeatedly offers help without needing recognition, who seems uncomfortable with confrontation, and who takes pride in being the confidant or moral anchor of a circle. It is often the individuals most respected for their reliability, generosity, or ethical standards, like Miranda, who find themselves in the crosshairs. Manipulators understand that these strengths, when unguarded, can be strategically used to activate guilt, mute dissent, and gradually draw the target into a private alliance defined by secrecy and conditional approval. Consider the story of Owen, a compassionate high school teacher known not only for his support of students, but also for being the problem solver on staff. When a new department head arrived, Owen felt honored to be drawn into late-night discussions about policy, faculty morale, and the hidden sabotage supposedly at play by certain colleagues. These revelations, dripped out in hushed tones, created the illusion of a special partnership between the two. Before long, the department head began steering Owen to avoid certain staff members, hinting that his reputation and the well-being of the department rested on loyalty first, transparency second. Requesting a favor or silent complicity became almost daily occurrences. By the time Owen recognized how much of his professional compassion and time had been redirected from students and peers toward protecting the head's agenda, his isolation was already well advanced, and his working relationships quietly strained. This progression hinges on a series of almost imperceptible psychological shifts. Initially, the target interprets the manipulator's confidential information or praise as evidence of being valued in a unique way. The impulse to reciprocate is reinforced by an increasing sense of responsibility for the manipulator's well-being or mission. Subtle rewards support even deeper entanglement. A compliment here, reassurance that the team couldn't cope without you there. Small boundary crossings that seem harmless at first become routine. The favor is just a small one, or the secret is only about efficiency, not malice. Yet, every time the target chooses loyalty to the manipulator over their own instincts or relationships with others, the security of that private alliance becomes more seductive and less negotiable. The net effect is gradual lowering of personal defenses, less willingness to question behavior or seek outside perspective, and mounting anxiety around openly disagreeing or expressing independent kindness to those outside the approved inner circle. Case studies in workplace psychology show that in teams where one member is isolated as the trusted one, that individual typically suffers elevated stress, diminishing creativity, and reduced confidence in their judgment. In families, children singled out for adult confidences or set up as parent protectors experience chronic confusion about their roles, guilt for breaking loyalty, and shame if they break ranks. The cycle is not one of overt coercion, but of small incremental guilts, and the suppression of natural empathy for others. Over weeks or years, the target may not even remember the last time they acted with unencumbered trust or sought friendship without worrying who might take offense. Recognizing this well-camouflaged manipulation is not optional. It is the groundwork for authentic resistance. To see how and why you're selected is to shine a light on the hidden cost of distorted kindness and misplaced loyalty. Identifying the gradual tightening of allegiance allows you to fight not just for your own emotional freedom, but for healthier communities where kindness stands on two solid feet, strength and truth. Next, we delve into how these subtle patterns intensify, wrapping more tightly around identity and making reclaiming oneself feel like a feat of real courage. In exploring the hidden tactics of psychological manipulation, this book has revealed how subtle patterns, undermining confidence, demanding compliance, sowing chaos and twisting kindness, gradually erode self-esteem, clarity, and independence. By learning how to spot triggers, resist pressure, and stand firm while remaining compassionate, you gain the tools to protect yourself and cultivate authentic relationships. Your strength grows each time you recognize manipulation for what it is and choose your response with intention and courage. Thank you for joining this journey toward emotional resilience with stealth psychology. If you found value in these insights, please like, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe for more empowering content.